Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Leadership Link. I'm Carla Bourque, CEO of Rebrandly, and I'm really glad you're here with us today. And I want to prepare you. Today, we're going to be diving into a tough but incredibly important topic, the proliferation of abusive content targeting children online, known as CSAM. I'm going to be speaking with Dan Sexton, who's the Chief Technology Officer at the Internet Watch Foundation and the IWF. If you're not familiar with the IWF, they're an amazing UK-based nonprofit organization that's doing the hard work 24/7 of finding and removing child sexual abuse imagery from the internet. Hey, Dan, how are you this afternoon?
I'm good, thank you.
Thanks for joining this conversation. I'm excited to chat with you and dig into some of the topics that are top of mind for those of us that are thinking and working and operating in the world of internet security and online safety. As a partner to the IWF, Rebrandly is obviously intimately familiar with your mission and purpose and goals. But for those that aren't, could you just give a bit of an explanation of how the IWF works and all of the important work that you're doing?
Yeah, of course. The IWF, we're a UK-based charity and non-profit. Our mission is to find, assess, and remove images and videos of child sexual abuse from the internet. We work with industry, so we're primarily funded by our industry partners and industry membership. In addition to finding and removing content, a key part of that is not just taking content down off the internet, but ensuring it stays down. And that's where our industry partnerships become really important, is we can find an image once, finding and taking data about the imagery, about where it's hosted, and providing that to industry enables them to block access, enables them to block sharing, and helps us actually enhance the impact that our hotline has of keeping children safe online.
It's a lot of work and it takes partnership, as you said. When we think about who's involved in this effort, which is really a global effort and it requires coordination, collaboration, investment, as you said. Partners include other platform companies, data providers. Can you talk about the composition of partnership to give context and scope to just how big this effort is in solving this global problem?
We've been around for nearly 30 years, and actually what we've seen is our industry membership has really changed over the last 30 years, the way the internet has changed. So in the early days, IWF was founded by internet service providers in the UK. So those network providers, because at the time, they really were the internet for all intents and purposes. The companies that run the wires, that connect houses to the internet and all the connections there. And a big part of our work in those days was both receiving reports from the public to try and have content removed as people were being made aware of it. And later, using some technical interventions with internet service providers, so they would block access to websites and web pages which are hosting that content, to make it reduce the chance of people getting to that, reduce the chance of people stumbling on it, add that bit of friction to help us remove that content. We now have more than 200 members across the technology sector. So we have a lot of the big social media companies and platforms, content distribution networks. As the internet has changed, so it's not just preventing access to websites, but also finding and removing content. The way our membership has changed as well, and the sort of data and services we provide has changed, adding sort of levels of friction. We do a lot of work with schools and school providers that have a duty set in the UK and elsewhere to keep their own internal network safe. We still have a lot of the internet service providers, not just in the UK, but actually all over the world now, where there is this sort of demand that actually it's not a problem for the UK. It's not a problem just for part of the world.
Sure.
The internet is a global place. So we have a global membership. Many of the big American companies make up a lot of our funding, a lot of our membership.
It's impressive. We were talking recently about what I think of as the visibility gap. At a surface level, all of us click on links, we visit websites, we use our mobile phones. Hopefully, we're not actively engaging or being subjected to CSAM, but we know that a large portion of vulnerable populations and global populations are subject to abusive content. How do we, as partners, leaders, and stewards of this mission to create a better, safer internet for all, solve the visibility gap and shed light on what's happening below the surface, what's happening in the back end of systems that we don't have access or visibility into? How do we solve that gap and create more awareness to drive more action?
My remit really at the IWF is the technical interventions. And this is really key to that industry engagement of how we work with different partners to add friction and make it harder for imagery to be created, harder for it to be shared, stored, distributed, harder for it to be accessed. There is no sort of magic bullet here. There's no one solution that's going to suddenly fix the problem. There are different harm types. There are different people being targeted, and different children, different victims targeted in different ways for different reasons, different bad actors. The people who are accessing CSAM, some of those people potentially always been there, always have
Mhm.
it. People that have a sexual interest in children. It's very different to people that might stumble across content and go from one sort of content and into another, or those that have no intention of ever viewing CSAM, but they've been exposed to it anyway. One of the trends we saw recently, there's this because there's perception of when you're stumbling across CSAM, does that really happen? Do people
Yeah.
accidentally, or is people intended there? And one of the trends we saw recently was where there are these what we've called these sort of invite pyramids, these schemes where people are hosting websites dedicated to child sexual abuse, and membership of those websites, they were being encouraged and rewarded for sharing links to that website. And they were getting rewarded number of clicks. And this is the same sort of behavior you would get with spammers and bot farms and those sorts of
Mhm.
things. And at this point, you had a large number of faults coming to the IWF because these were people who were being encouraged to click on the links. And those people had no interest in going to these websites, but they were fooled into clicking the
Incentivized.
links, being presented with this horrendous content. So it's just that idea that it is just everyone that's accessing content has a particular view there. These are just members of the public that are being exposed to that. And then preliminarily, you have this battle where people are trying to find new exploits, new places to host their content and share their content. And it might be your service is not designed for that. That's not what it's for. But if people can, they
It
will
will.
try and find a
Mhm.
way, misusing those services for their own ends. So actually, it's not just enough to block something. It's actually looking at all the ways people can protect their services. People can introduce friction to make it harder for it to be abused. And the harder it is to share the imagery, harder it is to get to the imagery. I really do believe that means that is the way that we actually reduce the impact. It might not solve the problem completely. Part of the problem we have at the moment is it's just too easy to do. There's too little friction, and that means we just get more and more of that content and more people being exposed to it.
Yeah, the friction strategy is a really powerful one. And one of the things that I think is really unique about your role at IWF is the fact that, as you said, you come to this problem from a technical context and with technical expertise and experience to be able to identify the ways that we can introduce friction as an industry and in partnership, but also systematically disrupt the supply chain of CSAM. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is understanding the fuel behind that supply chain specifically. Like most supply chains, they're driven by commercial outcomes and market demand. And so, do you think that the friction strategy by introducing blockers and making it more difficult for bad actors and criminals to create, distribute, and share and profit from CSAM is friction enough, or is there something else that we should be thinking about proactively to
Well,
solve for the future?
the sharing and access to child sexual abuse, it's a complicated area. It's not very easy. There are different bad actors in this case. So there are those that are absolutely like the example of these pyramid type sites where people are profiting from, or they get more access, the more people click on the links. There's commercialization there. So there are sites that accept direct payment. So you can go to a website and you can buy access. And indeed, one of the ways we introduce friction there is we talk to the payment providers and say, look, your payment option is being advertised on a site for the sale of CSAM, and providing that, and that's been valuable information to some of those payment providers to withdraw that service because they don't want their services used for the sale of child sexual abuse. With things like cryptocurrency, we've seen elements of cryptocurrency flag those wallets as potentially being used for payment. Again, that information can be used to highlight sort of bad actors. So it's always the trends change,
Mhm.
and then you start to find ways to introduce that friction and make it harder. Now, these actors will keep moving from place to place, but this is not a reason to give up. Keep being innovative and keep chasing them and keep finding new ways to prevent that. That being said, not everything in this case is a commercially motivated. There is a lot of sharing, a sort of sharing quid pro quo, where people are sharing content in these sort of like-minded communities, and they're sharing content in order to get access to more content. The imagery may be the same, but the motivations are different, and the methods you'd use to tackle them are different. There are different technical interventions for those different groups, both valid, but we can't just sort of loop them all as one thing and expect to fix it with one method.
Yeah, that's such a great point because, as you said, the motivations are different. And to make an analogy to, targeting, ad targeting, the profiles and the personas are different as well. The audience composition, to put it into, slightly more familiar terms for some of our audience, if you're trying to reach a market or combat competitive threat, you need to think about the motivators and the systems that are driving that behavior or those outcomes. It's such a complex problem that you're trying to solve and that we need to solve together. When you talk about innovation, one of the things that was so shocking to me in the recent IWF report looking at 2024 trends was about the proliferation of AI generated content. And I'd like to just unpack the role of AI in CSAM. And obviously, a lot of people have a lot of feelings about AI, whether it's good or bad or both or neither. And like most things with technology, it's a blend and it's complicated. I'm excited about the opportunity for AI to help mitigate and support prevention and detection. But we also, I think, need to consider and shed light on the role of AI at the early part of the supply chain in creating the content. So as CTO and, at IWF leadership, how do you think about AI and how should the general public consider AI's role in this battle?
The use of AI for creating child sexual abuse content is, I think, AI for many people, generative AI particularly, has caught a lot of people by surprise. It feels like one of those things that sort of happened overnight. Obviously, the reality for those that have been working for machine learning for decades and decades, that's not how things work.
Right.
Definitely sort of a breakthrough moment where, much like with other parts of the internet, the technology became more available, more easy to use. I think some really interesting questions here about open source and democratization of AI
Exactly.
and that closed source and sort of keeping it within the handful of a few very big, very powerful companies. The majority of AI generated content that we have found being shared on the internet is being using those openly available open source models. It's being downloaded off the internet, customized, run locally on machines, and then the content is then shared. Guides are being shared, instructions. Generally, where we've seen that imagery being shared, it's the same communities. It's the same communities that already existed for sharing of child sexual abuse, that were already helping each other with sort of coercing children over the internet in order to create more content and share more content, find content of existing victims. And these communities were then looking at use of AI to generate that imagery as well. So same kind of bad actors potentially, but a new method, a new very concerning method to create what effectively an infinite amount of new imagery. One of the trends that I think has been even more concerning there is actually when we see this technology coming out from those areas and those communities being actually commercialized and made more available. And these are things like declothing and nudifying apps, where actually you're then starting to see stories where these are incredibly easy to use websites. You upload an image and it removes the clothing, and images of children being uploaded and turned into child sexual abuse. And the barrier to entry there, this is not dark web communities that are already focused, these sort of niche
Right.
communities. This is being made available, and we're starting to see stories of children creating sexual imagery of their peers. And that is new. This is not the typical groups. This is actually, you're getting sort of peer-on-peer case. So the ways that you would address that are going to be very different to the way you address those people with sexual interest in children and those dark web stuff. So it's both a new technology, it's enabling actually a new harm group, a new group creating this content. And that's that worry. And always the case is when the technology becomes readily available, it gets exposed to more people, there's more danger. It's harder to then put that genie back in the box. It's harder to stop that spread.
That is so disturbing. I never could have imagined that tools like that existed, honestly. To your point, it really sheds light on the extent to which technology can be used and the unintended consequences, perhaps, of maybe a perfectly benign video creation tool being manipulated and directed to cause harm, deliberately cause harm. In that scenario, if we just take that a bit further, and I know you're a parent as well, and so these topics are really difficult to talk about, but important to talk about. For mitigation of that type of scenario where children are using these technologies to bully, manipulate, and cause harm to their peers, with all of what we're talking about, abusive content, internet safety and security, there's a socio-economic context, but there's also a behavioral context. Who's responsible for stopping that behavior with children? Obviously, technology always plays a role because without it, most of what we're talking about wouldn't be possible. But before the internet, before AI, there were bad actors performing in different channels and in different ways. Given the modern state of CSAM, it's a pandemic, is how I consider it. What is the role of parents and local governments to really reinforce what's appropriate and reinforce and establish social norms or redefine them?
There's no one solution that's going to solve all
Yeah.
of these problems. And actually, what you need to look at is how you take different interventions and complement them for different harm types, different bad actors, different victims, different ways of creating and sharing content. So there's something like a nudifying site or app. Well, if it's an app on an app store, there's an inherent area of friction there is that you need to stop it getting onto the app store. If it's on a website, there are mechanisms. How do you get onto the website in the first place? How do you create and register your domain? How do you get to server hosting? How do you get a certificate for your encryption? So there's lots of
Layers.
potential ways to
Yeah.
actually introduce a bit of friction to make it a little bit harder. Are you getting services from a content distribution network? And actually, there's a role there for regulators and lawmakers to set down where there's crime happenings and legal harm and saying that's not allowed. The rest of the ecosystem has to play its part to just make it harder to get to. That doesn't mean that working with parents and children isn't incredibly important as well. And as important as that is, we're always very careful about trying to put too much emphasis on the victims and saying you need to protect yourself, and too much emphasis on the parents and saying you need to fix that. Because actually they were asking people to fix problems which are incredibly difficult. It's how is this available so easy to get to? And actually what you need to do is everyone needs to play their part
Yep.
to start to add that friction and make it harder. Parents need better awareness. Children need to have better understanding of
Education.
online safety.
Yeah.
But we can't just say to children, stay off the internet. It's not safe.
Yeah.
And you can't say to children, don't upload your images onto the internet because someone might use it to create sexual imagery of yourself. It's just not fair for those children to have to shut themselves off from life because some people will use that. And I think that's very cautious not to get into that where you're blaming the victim for their own abuse because their images are on the internet and someone else has created sexual imagery. That's not fair on those people. It's not fair on those children that are child actors. It's not fair of those young famous people. That's what they're doing, and suddenly they're being punished for that by the internet because of that usage. So I do think it's that whole system approach. We do need to look at everywhere, and actually if you get all of that working, then you get to a position where this becomes, hopefully it's not a pandemic, whether it'll go away completely, just minimizing as much as possible to the point where it is a small number of people that are affected by it rather than a risk that every child is now going through.
100%. That's such a good point in terms of not victimizing the victim and not penalizing and punishing the victim as well. I think a lot of the tools that the IWF produces and shares and makes available are really powerful in giving more control and creating safe boundaries for children and others. So whether it's reporting mechanisms, more education, some of the campaigns that the IWF are running now are really impactful and being very, very direct, speaking in pretty frank language about what's happening. And some of the content, I hope, gets to a broader audience. Empowerment, education, training for parents, children, for anyone who's engaging in the internet seems like a must-have. But it's difficult to do that, and the IWF is just one organization. How do you think about the macro effect or the ripple effect that IWF can have in creating, greater market share of awareness? It seems like the IWF carries a big burden, obviously, and we want to share that as, as human beings operating in this global ecosystem. What will it take for local to become global in terms of prevention and awareness?
The awareness and the campaigns, these are evidence-based. The areas that we target to raise awareness of, it's because we are seeing the harms happening. When we're seeing content being created of children where there appears to be at home, on a smartphone or webcam or enabled device, we can make campaigns to target that particular crime because we were seeing those children in those settings. So we know it's happening, and actually raising that awareness is this is not just theoretical. This is we're seeing the content and we're seeing
The
the results.
context. You're seeing the
The
actual
context
context.
on there and saying, actually, how do we prevent this? How do we raise awareness of this to help this stop not happen to the next child? This is, I think, what adds that extra sort of leverage behind our campaigns is they really are based on the evidence that we see and the harm that we see going out there. The trouble with the campaign is they never stop. Crime doesn't stop, the harm doesn't stop. And actually being able to continuously raise that awareness without people sort of tuning it out means it's a concerted effort. You can't just run one campaign and say, we've done
Yeah.
our job, because you've reached some people, particularly with children, because those children grow up and then the next generation of children come.
Yeah.
They need to know too. It's not a one-time thing. It needs to be continual awareness raising, and it needs to continually change as the harm types change, as the evidence changes. So you're always ensuring as much as possible that we're not playing catch up and we are getting the right, most relevant data out there to the most relevant groups, whether it's parents or children.
Yeah. Getting ahead of it, more proactivity versus reactivity. As you said, there is no seasonality to what we're talking about. It's an evergreen issue, and it requires an evergreen and coordinated, orchestrated effort. What is the role of law enforcement in what we're talking about at a local level, but also at a global level?
So for us, certainly in the UK, our relationship with law enforcement is incredibly important. So our focus is finding and removing the content. It's to stop the distribution of child sexual abuse, to stop the re-victimization of the children in those images every time their imagery is shared. What we do is every time we find images of child sexual abuse on the internet, we share that in the UK with the child abuse image database, the central database from all child sexual
Hmm.
abuse imagery in the UK is shared. And I hope that intelligence and data then can go into law enforcement so that ideally they can identify and rescue those children, particularly the children at risk. So new children that haven't been seen before, children that might be at an active risk right now. And that's incredibly valuable. There are a number of stories where we hear about children we've rescued because of these cyber tips that have come through. And we hope that IWS work in some way contributes to that. It contributes to that and enables some of those kids that wouldn't, potentially would still be abused now to have been rescued.
Those stories are really powerful. It's not just giving voice to the issue, but really giving a face and giving reality to the problem. These are real children that we're talking about every moment right now. And as I said, it's difficult to comprehend and difficult to really convey the impact. Difficult topics are things that are not very popular at dinner parties or, trade shows and customer conferences. But this is the reality of our world today, and we really need to keep pushing the message forward. So on the topic of who's responsible, so we talked recently about the supply chain and the flywheel and the ecosystem and how we get it moving faster in terms of prevention and detection. If you had one, one wish that could come true overnight with a wand, what would it be for all of the tech solutions and platforms that play a part in this? What is one thing they can actually do?
So the one thing for us that really affects our work is proactive pre-screening of content, proactive detection of known images and videos of child sexual abuse, because it's a solved problem. Our analysts go onto websites, they get reports from the public, they're looking around, they're finding often the same images of the same children again and again being circulated on the internet. That should not happen. We should be able to fix that problem. We can fix that problem. So just asking platforms, anywhere there's a risk, anywhere where it accepts user-generated content, where there's a risk these images can be uploaded and shared, just to check at the point that an image is uploaded. Hashing technology is something that's been around since early
Early
digital
days.
files.
Yeah.
The perceptual stuff been around for more than 10 years. And all I'm talking about there is you run an algorithm against an image, turns it into a number. You check that number against a list of numbers of known child sexual abuse. If there's a match, it's an image of a child being sexually abused, and you stop it. You don't allow that to be uploaded. And if that was uniformly standardized across all these spaces, when we find one image of one child, we take it down once, and we should never see that on the internet again. When a child reports their imagery to us and says, someone is sharing my images, or I'm worried that this image is going to be shared, to give them the assurity that, we'll
It's
put this
taken
in the
care of.
list.
We've
It
got
will
you.
not be shared again.
Yeah.
And it won't be shared again. This idea that there are things on the internet are on the internet and you can't do anything about it, it's just not true. You can, you just need the willingness to put it in everywhere. And then by that point, you start to give that assurity and you start to problem that problem. Then we start to push back a little bit. And then I feel like we can start to win. We can start to give that assurance to children. We can start to see our impact enhanced. So that would be the one thing that I would like to see on the internet. It's not the end of it.
Right.
Once you've got that, the next thing is, what about the images we haven't seen? What about all the content that we don't know about? The children that haven't reported, the ones that we haven't seen, how do we address that? Without having that detection of known content, we can't stop the distribution. So scalable technical interventions, that's I think the bedrock of our work.
100%. And it seems as though AI should be able to help solve that problem. When we're talking about algorithmic changes, relying on, a line of code with very clear identifiers around image and hashing. Why is it so hard? There are a lot of smart people trying to tackle this problem. Is it the motivations?
It is not a technical problem. This is not an
Right.
engineering issue to
Right.
solve. It is it's a will. It's a policy issue. And actually, we're really just talking about really the sort of content moderation, the bare minimum of content moderation is don't allow this imagery to be shared on your platform. Don't allow it to be uploaded onto your service. Unknown content, very easy to fix. The next issue is where AI starts to become, AI for good, is detecting new victims, new children, stuff that hasn't got into that. And if that's going to be really effective, you can have this really powerful workflow where known content is blocked. Content that looks like it might be child sexual abuse gets flagged by AI. That should then be moderated by a human to
Yep.
confirm. And then if it is real content, if it is a child that's being sexually abused, that
Verified.
gets added to your known list,
Hmm.
verified, and then the access blocked. And you have this really positive cycle where actually we are removing all the known content, stopping it from being shared, and then we're finding all of the new content and stopping that being shared. And this is how you start to actually add that friction to reduce the chance of distribution. And you've seen the signs, we've seen this with bad actors, is the bad actors will be attracted to platforms which have poor content moderation. Because if you want to share something and it gets blocked, eventually you'll stop trying and you'll go
Right.
somewhere else. And you just see this push down to the corners of the internet, and it gets harder and harder to share. There is an element of just having this on the mainstream internet, of just not being able to share this content should just be a given.
100%. So we're talking about operators at the user level who are sharing, getting blocked, and that's where the friction, strategy comes into play and can be really effective. I want to go to the platforms and the concept of policy. So one of the things that seems to be missing are the repercussions or the outcomes and consequences of platform providers who are not only willingly give the benefit of the doubt in some cases, but there's a lot of public information out to show that leaders of platforms that are producing and sharing content are knowingly rolling back security and privacy protection. What's the recourse for that? If there's no retaliation and no friction at that level from either government or law enforcement, then what's to stop platforms from continuing to make content available and repeatedly share it for presumably gains that tie to audience and overall traffic and other metrics for which shareholders place a high premium?
I think about where that might go. So if that is the direction that the world goes into, where there's just this, anyone could do anything, it doesn't matter who gets hurt, what sort of internet do we end up with at the end of that? Is that the internet that people want to use?
Mhm.
Is that the one that you want to go to? Is that where advertisers are spending their money? Is that where you're going to try and attract your audiences? So a lot of the underpinnings of attracting people to platforms based off user-generated content, so encouraging people to share their content, encouraging those people to go to those platforms, and use advertising models that build
Mhm.
around that. If you don't want to go to that platform anymore, then you don't have an audience. You don't have an audience. There is no one to advertise for.
Mhm.
And the whole thing just sort of falls apart. And we end up with this, who is the internet for at that point?
Right.
Or are people are using it at all? And what I hope is, let's hope we don't get to that point. But if we get to that point, I hope the market forces and everything around the internet will say, this is not actually good for anyone. It's not good for business.
Yeah.
It's not good for the end user. It's definitely not good for the vulnerable, for the children and those people that are suffering
Mhm.
here.
And for
And I would hope
society
to see
globally.
for society, and actually maybe there'll be those platforms out there, those new platforms that go, do you know what, let's create a better version of the internet. Let's create a safer platform that people want to
Right.
come to. And actually you get that race to the top rather than that race to the bottom. I don't want to get to the bottom first
100%.
and all the harm that does before we make that realization. I think people should understand that now is, why do people want to go to these platforms in the first place? And not out of outrage, not out of just freedom, anyone can do anything. Actually, people want safe experience. We shouldn't be able to say, no, children just shouldn't be on the internet. It's too unsafe. Let's build an internet that is safe enough for children and everybody else. And then people will want to use it.
100%. 100%. I had a thought about yeah, about the reaction and, the message and how difficult it is to get people who are in the position of being able to make these decisions to pay attention. And I just love your thoughts on that because we work with a lot of these platforms. We know these people and I fail to understand why it's so difficult to communicate that promoting and taking a position of stewardship for online safety and security doesn't have to be at the expense of, profitable growth and responsible growth and commercial success. What else do we need to do to share and broaden that perspective? These are not mutually exclusive goals. In some cases, platforms like the ones you mentioned, some of the evolution we're seeing of new platforms evolving to create a better, safer environment and a different type of internet for all are actually, more attractive and probably at some point in the very near future, more profitable, more successful, and more engaging from an investor standpoint. How else do we tell that story?
Maybe one of your earlier questions is, what should we be doing as parents, as the public, as the people out there? And maybe we
Mm.
should start thinking about the choices that we make, the products that we use. People start thinking about actually putting their values in those decisions, and actually use the platforms that value safety, that value your online safety and your privacy, that are looking to actually create a better internet rather than ones that are not. And actually you start driving people as consumer choices, maybe you start to see those platforms change there. And the others is also talking about the people we elect, our governments and regulators, and actually saying, holding them to, because if they're there for the public benefit, then ensuring that they are upholding our needs. We do have the levers to do this, and you have seen examples in other places where sentiment has changed. And the world has started to change for the better. And actually, I think that is not a case of just wait for someone else to make that decision. Actually, start making those decisions yourself. More and more people do that. You start to see that, hopefully, that collective benefit.
100%.
Impact.
Yeah, focusing on what we can do and the impact and the trends. Obviously, IWF reports not just on the increase in incidents and proliferation, but also on the efforts that are really making a difference. A reduction in reported cases, not because they're not happening, but because the efficacy of the systems and the tools that IWF is making available are really making a difference. Can you talk a little bit about what the future looks like, what the beacons of hope are that you see that we can leverage to, shed light on what's really working and to continue to double down on those efforts as, partners, as parents, as part of the public?
Despite some of the discussions about backing away from content moderation in some places, which obviously gives us a lot of cause for concern, we have seen other places which are really leading new, and particularly in the UK for the Online Safety Act. This is what we voted for, this is the democracy's asked for, is for our government to start to put in regulations which serve our best interests. And that will, I hope, start to show those baselines of this is what you need to do for your platform to be safe. The internet has been wild for many years. And eventually, the Wild West did get tamed, right? It did eventually. Civilization came in and said, that's, the innovation's there, but actually we need to have some rules here. So we need to start ensuring, particularly to protect the most vulnerable people from the most powerful. So seeing the Online Safety Act come in, hopefully we'll start to see some of those bare minimum, the stuff that we really need to see standardized across places, certainly in the UK. And Australia, the e-safety regulations there, also trying to, again, some really interesting stuff going on there about looking at these harms that are happening and taking proactive measures to make the internet a safer place, and not just waiting for the harms to happen and then reacting it. So there are elements there actually which I think has a lot of hope for the future. And if we can see these regulations come in and see them be successful and see them actually benefiting and making a better internet, and not see some of the concerns that people are worried about over-regulation or over-moderation, and those things not happening,
Right.
I think the whole world will say, actually, maybe this is a good thing. And then we'll start to see that across the world everywhere else. And then actually maybe we'll see that push towards that safer internet, because that's what people want. Ultimately, I think that's what everyone wants to see.
Yeah, I agree. I share your conviction and your sense of purpose. So thank you for all the great work and for having this conversation. And hopefully it'll be just one of many that we are able to engage in on this topic. So thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you for Rebrandly support for the IWF.
Absolutely.